from LA to Piscataway. All Big Ten all year long. This is Big Ten 10.
The last time the Oregon Ducks were in a position to compete and possibly win a national championship 10 years ago, it was the first year of the 4-team college football playoff back in 2014. Fast forward 10 years, and 2024 is the first year of the 12-team college football playoff, and Oregon this year, a lot like 2014, has a roster that can definitely compete at that level. But will they get to the same type of level that they did 10 years ago? To talk all about the Ducks as we look forward to 2024, we welcome in Max Torres from ScoopDuck, the Oregon on 3 site. Max, always great to talk to you. Here's the first thing that I want to tackle. What are some of the biggest differences, do you think, from the Dan Lanning era of Oregon teams to maybe those previous eras? We mentioned 2014, 2010, and 2011 with Chip Kelly were some really good football teams as well. What would you say are the biggest differences from these two eras of Duck football?
Ted, I think the way I want to start this off is I think you have to look at my bread and butter, which is recruiting. The recruiting forefront, the recruiting landscape has just changed dramatically, and the sheer caliber of player that you're seeing on an Oregon roster heading into 2024 is so much different than 2014. And that's not to say that the 2014 roster didn't have some big time recruits. Of course that's the case, but I just think that the level that Oregon is recruiting at now under Dan Lanning has significantly raised the floor for these Oregon teams that we're going to see this year and moving forward. So I think that's really where you have to start with this discussion. I think you see that predominantly along the offensive line. I think you're seeing Oregon recruiting bigger players, of course, in the trenches. And the Ducks had some great ones, like in 2014. I think Tyrell Crosby was the best one that you had along at your left tackle spot, and he was among the best in the country. But now you're seeing Oregon consistently recruiting 4 or 5-star caliber offensive linemen, the likes of a Josh Connerly or a Panay Sewell, that are really becoming more commonplace in every single recruiting cycle. So I think that's probably one of the biggest differences, as well as defensive back recruiting. And they're going incredibly national with their approach, which is something Oregon's always had to do just because of their location. But they're really, really leaning into that and doubling down on that.
Boy, that depth of talent, I think, that we see on these rosters, on paper, at least as of right now, is just such a big difference, I think, from when it was, like we say, 10 years ago. Let's talk about the quarterback position, because now I know this is not a complete apples and oranges position, or a comparison, I should say, but when we look at the quarterback comparison from where Marcus Mariota was in 2013 to where Dillon Gabriel was in 2023, of course, Dillon Gabriel was not playing for Oregon. Marcus Mariota was. Dillon Gabriel, because of the COVID year and all that, he's got a little bit more experience under his belt compared to where Marcus was. But let's kind of put that aside for a minute. When you talk about their years before 14 and 24, you look at Mariota, threw for 3,665 yards, completed about 64% of his passes, 31 touchdowns, 4 picks. Whereas you look at Dillon Gabriel at Oklahoma, he threw for just 5 yards less than Marcus at 3,660, completed about 70% of his passes, 30 touchdowns, and 6 interceptions, a very similar stat line. How different would you say are these guys, and do you think Dillon Gabriel can make that same type of Heisman jump to that 40 touchdown type of level that Marcus took in 2014?
I think the first difference that you have to notice here, Ted, is that Dillon Gabriel is a lefty. It might be an easy one to highlight, but that's obviously a big difference. I think their difference in stature is something that also jumps out to me. Dillon Gabriel, I think he's just a shade under 6 feet tall, and whereas Marcus was more that 6'3", 6'4" range for your quarterback. And I think that they both have that dual threat ability, but I think that Marcus was the better runner of the two. I mean, he was pretty much your perfect dual threat mold. I feel like his ability to improvise is something that I think was a little bit stronger than Dillon Gabriel's was, just by watching the two play. That's not to say that Dillon Gabriel can't, but I think that Marcus just was incredibly creative, maybe more so like we saw with Bo Nix last year at Oregon, and they both are incredibly accurate. Marcus had a great deep ball, and I think that his decision-making was probably a little bit crisper and sharper than Dillon Gabriel's. I know that's kind of been something that's been called into question, or maybe just critiqued a little bit heading into the 24 season is his ability to take care of the ball. I think that's something that's obviously super important when you have a team with aspirations like Oregon's. So I think those are some of the differences that kind of come to mind for me. But I'm super excited about Dylan Gabriel. I think he's going to be able to do a lot of special things in this Wolstein offense, and he's got all the experience to really take them to a pretty special spot in 24.
Now, I think one difference that I think a lot of people look at in this Oregon, you mentioned recruiting, right? And that's such a big part when we look at this next part. What we want to talk about is the uptick of talent at the wide receiver position. Definitely not saying Oregon was average or bad at wide receiver. They always had good talent, but I'm not sure if they ever had a wide receiver room like they're going to have in 2024 with the Tez Johnsons and the Evan Stewarts and the Trayshawn Holdens. I could go on, but I'd eventually lose my breath with all of the players that they have in this Oregon wide receiver room. How much of a difference do you think that has made on this Oregon offense and this Oregon program as a whole, with Dan Lanning really making an emphasis to have elite talent in that wide receiver room?
I think it's made a massive difference, Ted, because Oregon's, I think, always been known as a team that's been run first. They had some tremendous backs. They're never hurting for talent at running back. I think back to guys like Royce Freeman and Thomas Tyner on the 2014 team that went to the playoffs. But when you're looking at the wide receiver room and how much it's improved in recent years, you're bringing in All-Americans like a Troy Franklin. He's obviously huge. Jeremiah McClellan, Ryan Pelham, are some of the biggest names from this past year's class in 2024, the best the Ducks have ever seen. But I think they've really become balanced. I think they're still run first, but maybe more balanced than they've been in the past. And it just makes it harder for opposing defensive coordinators to game plan for them, because if you try to take away the run, then you're obviously leaving yourself a little bit more open to the pass. And just the caliber of receivers that they have is really, really impressive. And Troy Franklin is the latest example of that, probably cementing himself as the best receiver in program history after the special year he had in 2023. And to your point, too, it's like they didn't have bad receivers in 2014. Devin Allen, Darren Carrington, Dwayne Stanford, Charles Nelson is a bit of a smaller gadget guy. But I think they just do such a good job of getting a unique blend of skill sets. And also, I think some bigger receivers as well, just frame-wise. If you look at a guy like Kyler Casper, he's someone that a lot of people are excited to hopefully see take that next step. So I think that the improvement of the wide receiver room is really good for what they want to do on the field. I think it's also good for their optics, because for as long as Oregon's been an elite team, or pretty darn good team, maybe elite's pushing it, they haven't really been known as a school that really produces top-end wide receivers and has elite receivers year to year. But I think that this could really be where we see them take a step forward in that regard.
Yeah, and Ohio State, I'm sure, is going to get a dose of what Oregon looked like in the past with spreading things out and running the football with Chip Kelly as their offensive coordinator. They have certainly taken a step up, because I think when people in the Big Ten Conference, of course, the conference that Oregon is joining here this next season, when we think of Oregon, we think of high-octane offense and we think of flashy uniforms, but that offense looks a little bit different than it did maybe 10-plus years ago as well. Let's move from the offensive side of the ball to the defensive side of the football. We know that's where Dan Lanning's heart lies as the former defensive coordinator of the Georgia Bulldogs, that great 2021 Georgia defense. In 2014, they had some really good players up front. You look at DeForest Buckner, 13 tackles for loss and 4 sacks as well. Tony Washington, 11 and a half TFLs and 6 sacks. Eric Armstead went on to play in the National Football League. How would you compare to what Oregon has been able to do up front on defense and really beefing up amongst those front 7 guys on defense compared to where they were maybe 10 plus years ago?
Yeah, the easiest way to kind of tackle that one, I think, is you look at those guys like Eric Armstead and DeForest Buckner, and I think you're seeing those caliber of guys still in the program. Obviously, I think Derek Harmon is an example. He obviously comes from the transfer portal over from East Lansing with Michigan State. But you also see some of the younger guys. Mateo Uyunglele, he's a big one that a lot of guys are excited about with what he's going to be able to do from his freshman to sophomore year. But you're seeing those body types of Eric Armstead and DeForest Buckner, like that's present throughout the whole defensive line room, more or less. I think about a guy like Terrence Green, who's like 6'5", 6'6", certainly one of those first guy off the bus people that you want on your team. And I think about Jericho Johnson, who's another 300-plus pounder. Aiden Breland from out my way in Southern California at Mater Dei. He was another All-American that people were super excited about. So I think that you're seeing those body types, but it's not just along that starting line. You have that throughout the room. And I think Tony Tuioti has done a phenomenal job developing that group and really helping them try to take a next step forward. And then you also have a guy like Jordan Birch who's there. So I think that the floor and ceiling really of that room has been dramatically elevated because you're not only seeing top tier recruiting along the D line in the high school ranks, but are able to supplement that with the transfer portal. And I think that Birch a year ago, and then Derek Harmon, Jamari Caldwell this year are the latest examples of that.
You know, it's crazy. I mentioned apples and oranges. It's very difficult to compare the quarterback position. I will admit, it is hard to compare really any college football team pre-transfer portal to post-transfer portal. And that's a big thing about this football team. And you even go back to last year's football team, some of these transfers. You look at Harmon, you look at Jabbar Muhammad, you look at Evan Stewart. These guys would not be available in a previous era of college football as well. But it also goes to show how Dan Lanning has been able to adjust in his roster management and building that roster. A good mix of, what you're familiar with, recruiting, top 5, top 10 classes, and mixing some of those really good transfer players as well. So we've talked about where Oregon has gotten to, right? This is a team that's won conference titles. They've gotten to that national championship game amongst arm's reach of that flag at the top of the mountain, that game losing the national championship to Auburn in that 2010 season. We know about the 2014 season, losing to Ohio State. What gives you confidence that, whether it's this Oregon team, 25, 26, whatever it is, that a future Ducks team can maybe take that next step where teams maybe 10 plus years ago could make that next step and maybe they can win that championship, that ever elusive championship?
The first thing you have to look at is depth. That's something that, for as good as the 2014 Oregon team was, I don't think they had as much as Oregon has now, which is kind of why we're at this talking point. We've arrived at this talking point of, is this the greatest roster that Oregon's ever had? And I think it is under from my years covering the team. And I think that if you have that depth, that legitimate 2 deep, that's really been what they've been looking for, Ted, trying to build that out at every position. And I think you're really confident in that on the offensive side of the ball, just what Will Stein's been able to do. That's not the side that I think you have too much to worry about. I think what you're really looking at is, what is this defense going to be able to do? Because like you said, that's Dan Lanning's pride and joy. He's a defensive-minded head coach. He's a defensive guy. Is it going to be able to take that step forward to really become an elite unit that they've been trying to build? And I think you just have a different caliber of athlete, guys that can do a lot of really good things well versus like, he can only do this well. He can only rush the passer, but he can't cover. I think that you're just getting a better athlete in that defense that can do more things, which I think, just takes you to that next level, and you're able to really just be harder for opposing offenses to pick apart. So I think the depth is the big thing. And I think also just the size, like the way that the Ducks are built in the trenches, are really going to be, I think, a difference maker in getting them over that hump.
And over that hump, they strive certainly to get to one more apples and oranges comparison from one era to another. They're playing in the Big Ten and not the Pac-10 or the Pac-12, right? And that's, of course, on this channel, that's really the apples and oranges comparison that we really care about. You can catch Max and his buddy Justin Hopkins over there. ScoopDuck is the On3 Oregon Ducks website as well. They've got a lot of great online and written content, podcast on YouTube and the audio platforms as well. Max, it's always great to talk Duck football with you.
Thanks for having me on, Ted. I appreciate it.
Thanks for watching Big Ten Ted, where it's all Big Ten all year long. Make sure to like the video to spread the word of Big Ten Ted to the masses, and subscribe to the channel for updates on Big Ten content that drops every day.